We are so glad you joined us today to get centered, but we have a disclaimer. Being centered really is more of an aspiration than a destination. This is a vodcast where we'll be discussing all things mind and body, mental health, physical well-being, parenting, marriage, healthy touch, anger and how to handle it. What is integrative medicine? How do I meditate? What are we learning from COVID in this quarantine experience? Where do we go from here? You have questions on these topics, and we ask those same questions ourselves. So this isn't a vodcast full of answers. It's one full of discussion, because we're going to tell you right now we do not have all the answers, but we do love a rich discussion and hope you do too. We're Leila Scott and John Price, the founders of the Center for Healing Arts and Sciences, and this vodcast is hosted by our amazing team, which is comprised of an integrative group of therapists offering individual, couples, family, depth therapy, and offers support groups for men, women, teens, young professionals, and others. Chinese medicine practitioners offering acupuncture, herbal medicine, food therapy, lifestyle advice, and last but not least, our mindfulness meditation and spirituality guide. Be sure to reach out to us to let us know other topics you'd like to hear us discuss, or to let us know if you'd like to work with our integrative team. We are here for you and offering virtual care as well as home delivery of wellness self-care packages during this time of physical separation. Give us a shout at 713-526-4444 and be sure to follow us on social at Center for HAS. And now, please enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome back to Get Centered. Here we are, the team at the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences. We're going to talk today about anxiety. And we came to this topic because just looking at our practices right now, of course, a lot of people are feeling it and talking about it and trying to understand what this powerful force is that can take us over. So I want to just start with the definition of terms, and we can hear from each person, and we may find out something similar, and we'll also see where we differ. But who's got a decent understanding or definition of anxiety? How do you define it?
I guess like your body's natural response to stress, or like feeling of like fear or, apprehension of some sort.
I would differentiate from fear in that fear would be more an actual response to an actual threat, and anxiety is more of a perceived response to a perceived threat.
So something's wrong, right? We don't know what it is yet necessarily, but something. Although, what about that? Like, what if I have test anxiety? I know that I'm taking a test and I know what the object of my anxiety is, but maybe I guess, Rodney, what you're saying is that there is an uncertainty on how I'm going to perform. And so that unknown variable begins to take on the anxiety. It's not that I have a fear of test, right? Like it's not a phobia, like I have a fear of a spider or something. It's a fear of like, how is this going to go? There's an uncertainty. And so there's just an unknown component. What else?
I agree. I mean, I would just even elaborate too to say whether it's fear of unknown, lack of control, but it's also just a natural human thing that everyone feels. I think a lot of time when people think of anxiety, they think of like a diagnosis, which is typically what generalized anxiety, panic disorder, all those things. And that's a whole other escalation, right? That's when it's impeding on your functioning. That's when it's irrational. That's when it's holding you back. But I think, everyone experiences some form of anxiety, whether it's mild, sometimes it's more extreme, but it's a human response.
Yeah, I think it can be really healthy. And one thing that we even talked to our son about is, wait, is this scary or is this dangerous? I think we sometimes don't take the next step to ask that question. But I also find it very interesting that anxiety seems to be sort of a more rewarded emotion over depression. Anxiety and depression being opposite expressions of basically the same thing. Somebody will be very quick to say, I'm an anxious person, I worry all the time. That's something that they might lead with in getting to know a person. Whereas depression, someone is going to be more likely to hide that.
It's interesting you point that out, because I feel like I tell my clients that all the time, how there's like this new form of high functioning anxiety where it's like when you're people pleasing, when you are like a workaholic, so you can kind of twist that and saying like, oh, well, I have good work ethic, when it's like, no, you have a lack of boundaries. So I 100% agree with that. It's kind of like a cultural societal thing now to to depict like what aspects of anxiety are effective or useful to you.
Yeah.
I want to tease this apart though. Like that's an important comment about depression and anxiety and their relationship to each other. Like, help me understand how you're framing that, Leila Scott.
Well, essentially, based on a person's history or maybe even constitution, they might go into a depressive state versus an anxious state over the same thing that another person would go into an anxious state over a depressive state. So some people will say, what is it? Anxiety is about something that hasn't happened yet. Depression is about something that's already happened. But in any case, you can look at them as opposite sides of the same coin.
My
Yin and yang versions of each other, if you will.
Yeah, to amplify that a little bit, what I think of is where the libido goes. Because in the anxiety, libido is oriented to some kind of unknown external variable, seemingly external, outside of our subjectivity. I mean, it may be internal, like I may be anxious about something with my health, but that's still outside of my subjective experience. It's a biological. But then with the depression, the libido seems to retreats from the outer world and it goes within. And so is that kind of what you're getting at?
Well, John, I think it's important to define libido the way you mean it in a Jungian sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, energy.
Energy.
Yeah, it's so yeah, libido is not, it was kind of sapped up by the sex and sexuality, and looking at somebody's libido as in their kind of sexual energy. But really, if we kind of take the sexual piece out of that, which of course libido shows up there, but what it is my energy toward or with something. And in depression, what happens is that the libido retreats from things that give me a sense of interest and purpose, from friends and family, from going out and doing things that I enjoy or that stimulate me. And that energy kind of retreats, and the person is a bit numbed or lethargic. As opposed to anxiety, I think there's a certain like frenetic, active aspect to it where we kind of are almost constantly seeking. And I think that's also something that happens. I think in a state of anxiety, our seeking system is activated, but to Rodney's point, there's no external object necessarily to hang that on. Like we may get a sense of anxiety and it's like, what the hell is making me anxious? And so our mind is kind of going through like, what happened, or what was I carrying, or what's coming up that I might be feeling that with. So we're trying to find the threat. But nonetheless, the nervous system is really activated in that state of fight or flight or freeze.
Right. Well, just to add to that, so looking at the word depressed, it's being pressed down. Your energy is being pressed down to, go further on what you were saying about that libido retreating. But even just think about a wave. Part of it is expressing as an up and over. Part of it is expressing as a down and in. And you can't have one without the other. And it's just part of the circadian rhythm of life. We're going to have periods of time where we're more anxious. We're going to have periods of time when we're more depressed. But it's become this huge imbalance because of the pride and the social acceptance around anxiety being like what Nat was saying, like, oh, I can't sleep. I'm just constantly working, or I always worry about everybody, versus I can't get out of bed. I don't want to go do my job. There's nobody I feel connected to right now. Mm-hmm. They're both important expressions that we're all going to experience, but there's just this sort of excessive imbalance, I feel like, going on.
Well, I guess with definition of terms, when I was thinking through anxiety, and certainly my own anxieties and what I work with people that come into our offices, there is something normative. Like when I was in graduate school, in the same thing I imagine that happens with an infectious disease physician, they end up like anxiously diagnosing themselves with all kinds of things. But when you do therapy school, you end up going through a class called psychopathology. And in that class, you're basically like, holy shit, I have 37 different diagnoses. And the reason why that happens is because it's all on a continuum. So when we do psychological assessment, what we have is a clinically significant condition. So I have anxiety, but there's a point where my anxiety peaks and that it's now a clinical condition. There's a too muchness associated with it. And what I think psychotherapists and psychologists and psychiatrists have looked at, kind of speaking from this lane, is that there's something normal and natural about our anxiety, and even there's a union between performance and pressure. These two folks, Yerkes and Dodson, came up with the Yerkes-Dodson measurement, which basically is saying, like, if I've got just the right amount of anxiety, I'm sufficiently motivated to take on a task. If there's too much anxiety, in the test example, if there's too much, I can't see the words on the page, I can't think straight. If there's not enough anxiety, I didn't even show up to the test. So trying to find and kind of modulate that to be in the right sweet spot is important. What's happened today is that we've taken anxiety and we've made it kind of a bad word. It's a bad thing to feel anxious. So then our attitude with anxiety is to get rid of it. So anytime we begin to feel any degree of anxiety, immediately the system goes in, and then we have anxiety about our anxiety. And a lot of theorists look at this. One in particular, a guy named Stephen Hayes, talks about clean pain versus dirty pain. And this is an old Buddhist idea also, that clean pain is what I naturally feel. I mean, if I'm going to go ride a roller coaster, if I'm going to go do a lecture, if I'm going to, ask my now wife to marry me, anxiety is pretty natural, right? Like, that's a pretty natural thing to feel. But all of a sudden, it can kick over and it can petrify or terrify and make me immobile. And then back to that kind of neurological piece, fight, flight, freeze, all of a sudden my agenda is no longer about kind of encountering this thing. It's either overpowering it in a fight or withdrawing from it or freezing in a retreat. And then all of a sudden it's really about anxiety management and not about going at whatever we need to go at to be the person that we were created to be. Any thoughts on that at all?
There's also emotional layering, like you have the original anxiety. Maybe you can trace that to something, an event, something that's upcoming. But then there's the feeling about the anxiety, a judgment, a self-judgment. And so now you've got two emotions. And maybe that second one was, I'm angry at myself that now I'm all anxious and discombobulated. Well, now I've got, and then I'm going to add on to that judgment, and then it just becomes this tangled knot.
Yeah, I think of the like wise anxiety. That's what I think about in terms of this case. It's like, okay, I want my anxiety response to alert me to when I'm on a hike that there's a snake, that I hear a rattler, right? I want to know, I want that, I want kind of my senses open so that I don't get hurt. But the second I realize that the rope on the road is not a snake, I want to be able to drop the response, which is my full on, it's a natural response that I want to stay there, that says danger, right? Okay, let's be careful, right? Get into base, whatever the stance is, to sort of be able to escape. So how do I drop it quickly, right? So if it's comes and then that anxiety, and then I notice that it's a rope, but my body is still gonna hang on to that, that's anxiety to me, right? That's like, now I'm anxious that's unwise anxiety, right? Because I already know that the threat is gone mentally, but physically I'm still holding on to it. So it's like the alarm system. I want the alarm system to go off, but I don't want it to be going off every night, like I don't want it to go off waking the whole neighborhood up all the time. I want it to be calibrated.
Exactly.
I want to jump in, and Gia, maybe I want to kind of tee you up to talk about development here. But when we do think about the anxieties that tend to bring us into, converse with somebody, maybe you're seeking out a therapist, or you're coming to see an acupuncturist or somebody, a naturopath, integrative care, or even spiritual issues. What happens essentially, what we know from a Jungian lens, we talk about all of our emotionally toned experiences that take us over. They're called a complex. Jung called them a complex. And what a complex is an intrapsychic bundle of energy that has an emotional tone, it has a physiological response, and it tends to have a patterning, patterning with it, which is a thought pattern or a behavior pattern. I do the same things, I think the same things every time this thing constellates. And so what's interesting about that is it's almost like a time machine, because clinically speaking, when somebody has an anxiety, whether they're aware of it or not, or whether they're conscious of where it comes from, it can take us back to a time of history where the nervous system was either under-connected with or overwhelmed, right? There's a not enough-ness or a too muchness. And so my nervous system, and Leila Scott, this is also kind of landing in, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, but our nervous system has really a dual structure. And the sympathetic nervous system is the one, and I always mess this up, just catch me if I'm messing it up. Sympathetic nervous system is about arousal. And it begins to get you activated to prepare you to fight, flight, or freeze. The parasympathetic nervous system it conserves energy. And so you'll notice that when you begin to feel soothed, your whole entire body, you just take a breath, like, oh gosh, your pupils go back to not being dilated anymore. Your digestion starts again. Your heart rate lowers. Your blood kind of starts to go back all to your limbs. And what can happen though is that in our early life experience, if we don't have our needs sufficiently met, meaning, right, not too much and not overwhelming and not abandoning, there will be this bundle of energy that's created that shows up psychologically, spiritually, physiologically. And what will happen is later on in life, when I begin to feel whatever I feel in those moments, I experience that pattern of energy. So what happens when somebody comes into the analyst or psychotherapist's office is we begin to unwind, kind of uncoil the energy that coalesces around that wound. I mean, that's the crazy thing, is that when you feel overwhelmed, anxious, depressed, or whatever, that's a wound that's presenting itself from your history. And so what we tend to do is go, fuck that, I'm out. Like, I don't want to mess with that. I want to medicate it. I want to numb it. I want to get away from it. I want to get aggressive and act out in an angry way because I don't like the way this feels. And all of a sudden, to go to the psychotherapist's office, we say, well, tell me more about that. And then if somebody can, they'll start to connect their history with what is happening in the moment. And then you can start to not get rid of it, right? Because we can't like just take away our history, but we can begin to expand ourselves around it and learn to be different in that space.
That seems to me where the acupuncture fits in, right? And like the actual body work, because there's a certain amount of the mental work. And this is my experience. I mean, it's that the space of like figuring out where I am now as opposed to where I was when I formed that belief system, right? That myth that's driving the anxiety. Well, I also need to figure out where it lands physically, and I need an expert basically to come in who knows my body and who knows how the systems are arranged with each other, so that they can help me get the actual fix the problem from within, right? So like the wherever that is generating a physical, my experience, it's a physical thing that happened, right? It's a physical thing that I'm feeling or ignoring. It's either too much or it's there and I'm trying to push it out, just like you talked about, right? So if I have an acupuncturist who knows how to help treat what that thing is actually on my physical level, then now we've sort of done mind and body. And that seems to me to be like extremely important in this work.
Extremely, yeah. Acupuncture is pretty amazing at regulating the nervous system. I'll tell people, whether it's fertility they're coming into for cancer side effect treatment, I'll say, even though you're most likely to get other benefits out of this treatment, the one I can almost guarantee you're going to get is a downregulation of your nervous system, which is healing in itself. Because of course, the cascade of just illnesses that can come from a sustained amount of anxiety over a sustained amount of time is just incredible. It's incredible how much damage sustained stress can do to the body.
Gia, do you have any thoughts about
I've been like kind of listening and kind of soaking in what everyone's been saying, and it's kind of surprising. I mean, kids that walk through my door, it's literally like they're numbing themselves because they want to knock out that anxiety. I've seen it in some of the adults I see too. They just want to put it to the side or compartmentalize. And I feel like a lot of kids these days are needing to compartmentalize because, you know, as parents and as adults, we model these behaviors, which kind of put in the perspective of kids, okay, this is what I should do, or this is how I should do it, and this is when I should do it, as opposed to kind of, seeing themselves and working through the process of, this is what I need, and these are the boundaries that I need to set with my parents so that I'm not as anxious, or how can I more so use my anxiety as a benefit. Like friendships, I think anxiety is very, very beneficial is a very, very beneficial trait in friendships when the person who is anxious can be more empathetic and understanding to the issues that their friends are facing. And so, working with them, sometimes I bring up the topic of, so are your friends a reflection of what you want to see as the change for yourself? And they're like, holy shit, yes, but it's harder said than done. But they're more so kind of able to take that initiative for everyone else. And I think when you kind of look at the span or trajectory of development and stuff, and how we grow and progress, it's always kind of, parents are always modeling the behaviors that the kids are acting out upon, and vice versa. Sometimes the adults act as the kids, but they don't recognize it. And so it's very important for even parents to kind of take a step back, and just as humans in general, to just kind of look at ourselves and kind of like go in and be like, yeah, what is going on with my body right now? Or what is going on inside my head that's causing that, those higher expectations, but also the anxieties and the nervousness to kind of arise from me. Sometimes we kind of just put everything in little boxes and kind of ship them away to the back of our minds, and it never comes back. And then when they do come back, it's just kind of like, well, I'm not going to deal with this today. So it's definitely one of those things where, I think anxiety is an important word to bring up no matter what phase of life you're in. I think parents are kind of scared to bring it up because it's like, oh, you don't have that, or you're not experiencing that. But then when it kind of comes through, you're just kind of like, okay, now I actually have to deal with it. But how do I deal with it? So what's 2 cents?
I'm wondering what all this talk is kind of getting me thinking about last week's topic, or when we talk about memes. Was it last week? Whenever we talked about memes, it's like, I just wonder, we keep kind of we've been putting it on the parents, right? In terms of what they modeled for us comes out in us, right? So we've seen the parents do it, we want to model that behavior. But I'm also wondering, maybe this is a meme, right? Maybe this is actually somewhat of a societal response pattern that we have inherited, actually, that's not necessarily even our parents, right? Our parents maybe fit into that bigger superstructure that I don't know. I'm wondering. It's a meme from the past.
That's got something.
I'm so glad you bring that up, because I keep thinking about a meme that I read yesterday, which I literally laughed out loud at. So it explains the difference between Europeans and Americans. And in Europe, if you are sick, you can write an out of office email that says, hey, I'm not going to be back until September. If you email me, it's automatically going to be deleted. Whereas in America, it says, hey, I'm sorry, I'm extremely ill, I'm in the ER, please anticipate my emails to be delayed by 30 minutes. And yeah. I think it's so accurate though, sadly though, but 100%, I think there is that huge cultural component. And I think that ties in, John, with what you said about that performance pressure, right? And those perceived judgments, because at least for overall, if we're stereotyping a little bit, but American culture, I think there is that sense of, well, anxiety shows that I work hard, I have good ethics, that I'm loyal to my company, whereas depression is associated with slowing down and not being able to perform as much because it's numbing, right? And then that's associated with the judgment of, well, that must mean I'm lazy and I don't care, or I don't give a shit. When again, we're realizing these again, how influential I think these overall messages are. So I agree. I mean, sometimes we can have the best families, we can have the best upbringing, but it's the messages we get from our workers, our friends, our, again, just media in general that represents, okay, I have to act this way so that I can, I don't know, be representative of caring or again, of being motivated. Because I think that's a lot what comes up in my client caseload is, I have no motivation. I have no motivation. I'm like, well, is that the case? Or is your body informing you that you need to slow down because you're putting too much on your plate?
Mhm.
Yeah, as you were talking and that it continued on, I was thinking about the anxiety in general and things that I've led a lot of discussions for parents on sex, and in particular, how to initiate conversations with your children about sex and reproduction and creation and the like. And what I've learned very quickly, and I've started including it in really my intake when I start working with an adult, is how did your parents speak to you about sex? And the kinds of stories that I've heard are at times pretty unnerving, but also comical. Stories like, my one of my parents walked into the room and set a book down, didn't even look me in the eye, and then left. Or they walked in the room and locked the door behind them, and then we had the conversation, or we never spoke about it at all. Or my father tried to initiate the conversation after I'd started having sex. So what parents, when I talk to parents about this, there's such a complete uncertainty about how to go about the conversation that they just don't have the conversation. And that is one of those things that somebody may not even be aware that there's an issue with that. But what happens is that because we're totally tuned in to what's happening in our environment, and we respond to how other people are behaving, right? So should I be nervous? Should I be scared? Like, why are they acting that way? There's an unconscious part of us, our sensory system, that's just aware of what's happening. Our kids, and when we all really begin to take in those behaviors over time. And it's not something massive and it's not something acute, but it creates this relationship with someone's anxiety. And what that suggests is that, look, I don't know what's going on in there and I don't want to know. I'm just not going to go in that room. And then we leave people uninformed with this topic in mind. People are totally uninformed. But how that anxiety management, how that individual has managed their own anxiety will be directly related to how they're able to have these kinds of conversations with their children, for example, with their spouses, with their friends. Like, is there a fear of conflict? Does it make me anxious to communicate? Yeah, okay, like what's happening there? Why is it making me anxious? And rather than making it about like, I don't like that, so I don't want to go in there, it's, analysis or therapy is really about what's happening in here that tendency and habit is created in me. And am I even aware of the ways in which that habit has really affected my life? Like my life trajectory, I've gone that way when I could have gone that way. So I think the consequences of our threat and our anxiety management systems are massive, on a large scale. They're pretty massive.
Yeah,
In my
it goes back to approaching things with curiosity versus judgment or blame.
No doubt.
I mean, and on a personal level, just to keep it on the lighter side, as a result of being curious about when I have felt anxious, I have discovered, and I never would have otherwise, that sugar creates anxiety. About 20 minutes after I eat sugar, I can expect to have another hour or two of anxiety. So I know that now. So if I'm going to choose to have some sugar, I got to know that that's coming. And it's such a relief because it is this generalized, non-specific feeling that comes over me. And for years it was like, what's happening, but now I know, and I can make a choice to go there or not in that particular instance. Of course, there's other cases that I can't control because something is triggering and I just have to deal with those as they come.
What about caffeine as I sip away? Is that the same?
Yeah. John and I have a joke that when I have caffeine, I don't know if it's as much of an anxiety as much of a motor mouth situation.
But Leila, Scott, I'm
I think
curious
it's
too,
fun, actually.
definitely in terms of the nutritional factor, even the influence of like salt and sodium, because I know a lot of times when I work with my kids who have ADHD, I constantly remind the parents, like, let's pay attention to the foods that you're giving your kids. Because again, I mean, salty snacks are yummy for kids, but they're terrible for your system. So I'm curious what you think of the impact of that in relation to anxiety.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because, of course, salt is processed heavily by the kidneys, and the kidney is the organ that is essentially in charge of fear and fright. So, of course, they're going to tie together, you know.
We have to do an episode on that one of these days, on the, you know, the systems, organ systems, and the various like psychological, you know, the ways they manifest or their domain. That's an interesting topic.
Yeah, and we can provide a graphic, you know, to go with it so that people can follow along with
Cool.
which organs, emotions.
I'll put, like, I want one for my own wall.
Yeah.
Can I get that?
Yeah.
I'm like, we were talking about sugar, and I think sugar is one of the, it's in the similar category of like anxiety versus depression. It's like sugar, no, bad societally, right? We're like sugar, but salt. They're like salt, okay, no problem, right? But both of them are like they're both white powder substances that we sprinkle on things that are not necessarily that great for our health.
Right.
Yummy.
Well, whereas, although I would make an argument, salt is definitely important for your health in moderation, whereas sugar, you can make an argument, unless it's a naturally occurring form of it. When it's refined, there's just no place for it. I mean, look, I'm not a teetotaler. I eat refined sugar, but I can't make any cases for that being good for our health.
Well, that's part of this whole system, right? It's because it's like to say, oh, anxiety is only in my mind, in my psyche, is not true, right? Because it's in my body, right? It's also about what I eat, right? It's where I'm working mostly in terms of my own practice and the practice that I teach others is how do I recognize the moment, that kind of moment of fight flight, or how do I recognize that I'm in fight flight and then interrupt it and come back to the actual present moment of what's happening within my embodied senses? What am I feeling? What am I thinking? What am I hearing? Right? And sort of open up the lens to what is actually happening, as opposed to what I kind of anticipate might happen in the future or what happened before, right? So it's just like, how do I do that? And that's a muscle. It takes a lot of time to build that into life, and it happens in phases, and it's facilitated by all this other work that ends up shedding light on, like, if somebody's working with John or Rodney or Gia or Nat or and they come to me and they're like, they already know what's going on. You know what I mean? They know the pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So now we can start to look at how that manifests, right? How is that manifesting, and how do we start to use that so that we can unravel it, right? It's like that's been my huge work. I really need a lot more work on the diet thing, apparently, as I sip my sugary coffee.
Moderation is good.
I like something that Rodney said a while ago about, this is the piece, Ariel, the intellectual versus like the more experiential knowledge. Like Rodney, I'm citing you here, but I'm directly quoting you. I can know how to bench press 300 pounds, but when I go sit at the bench, it's a totally different endeavor when I'm actually doing it. And so I can know the pattern, but how I show up in the moment. Jim Hollis talks about this, where he says, it's not the person that's ignorant that like just draws their sword and blindly goes into the dragon's lair. It's the person who pisses all over themselves, is totally fearful, draws their sword and goes in anyway. That is a courageous endeavor. And so now that we're talking about how you feel that historical patterning of energy, and then have a degree of flexibility with how you then behave. You're not having to just be totally identified with the feeling and do what it tells you to do, but you're able to be with the feeling and then have choice in what you do, despite what your feelings are telling you. And that I think takes a lot of time to begin to not only bring conscious, but then to actually enact.
Yeah, and to me, there's a piece around integration there. One of the patients that I worked with, anxiety was a pretty big deal for her. And what we did was we integrated the two polarities for her, feeling completely calm and peaceful, and feeling completely anxious. And by the time we had finished integrating the two feelings, she realized that they could exist together. They did not have to be exclusively present in her psyche and soma, you know. And
Not
so
only could they do,
they do,
right? They
right?
absolutely do.
But with that layering piece, it's like, okay, here's anxiety. I feel it. I feel all the signs, and it's here and it's here. And now my choices went from here to here, you know. But when she started to realize that they were both present at the same time and they worked together as friends, not these things that were clashing, all of a sudden her world opened back up again.
All right, you guys, we got to start shutting it down. Any closing thoughts or last little threads that you've still got that you need to contribute to our soup today?
I just want to say, you know, as a practice, we always talk about how important it is to think about the mind and body together, right? And I think anxiety is such a great representation of that, because again, right, it's psychosomatic and it's cognitive. We can dull the accelerated heart rate, the sweatiness, but we can't shut off our brain, just as much as there's people who try to shut off their brain and then they end up having a panic attack out of nowhere because they keep pushing it down. So again, in a lot of these diagnoses that we talk about, these experiences people have, I mean, truly you have to heal from the inside out. I mean, it's so important to integrate all these different aspects of what it is to exist and be a human, because it's not just one particular thing that's off.
Well said.
Yeah, thanks for that, Nat. Anything else, y'all? Okay, looks like that's it for us today on our discussion of anxiety. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back next week talking about something else. See y'all later.